Let's do this. Gerry Chidiac, we are on episode number 23 of Crazy Damn Canadians. Thanks so much for being a guest today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And you are a very respected and admired teacher within School District 57 at Dutchess Park Secondary School.
Right, well, thank you.
Yeah, how long have you been at Dutchess Park?
Since 99. So I finished 21 years, going into 22 years at the same school.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And were you at a different school within the
I was
district?
at Immaculate Conception for a number of years before that. And, I did a few other things before that as well. But, yeah.
Definitely a few other things, because before Prince George, you lived in Montreal and Toronto.
Right.
But before those Canadian cities,
I grew up in Toronto.
Okay, so you grew up in Toronto.
It's kind of interesting. I grew up in Toronto. After graduating from university, I went to University of Western Ontario in London, which is actually where my brother teaches now. He teaches where I went to school.
Nice.
And did my teacher's college. And from there, I actually moved to Prince George. I came here, like a lot of people did at that time, with something called the Frontier Apostolate.
Now, I know that's Frontier Apostolate?
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's a little bit controversial now with with Bishop O'Grady and so on. So it's I don't know if I should say too much about that, but though the truth is, a lot of really good people came to Prince George with the Frontier Apostolate, and I think I have to give credit to that. Between Bishop O'Grady started in 1956 and it ended in 1993, and he attracted volunteers from all over the world. Some bit controversial characters like John Furlong, who organized the 2010 Olympics.
Yeah.
Who's a bit of a controversial figure, but he was a Frontier Apostle.
Yeah. Was he in Fort St. James for a while? Is that correct?
Or Burns Lake or something.
Yeah, somewhere out west, yeah.
Yeah. So, it's not without, but I guess, one of the things that I notice is looking back in history, there's good and there's bad, right? There's good and bad in all of us. There's good and bad in everything. And, so I think it's important not to write people off, right? Like, same thing with Bishop O'Grady. I wish, that we could actually sit down and talk to him and say, what was your intention? And talk to people who knew Bishop O'Grady and say, what, from the Indigenous community especially, and say, what was your experience with him and his work? And before we write people off to find out. And I think I wrote one of my columns on that, actually.
Yeah, you did, actually, and your columns have been brilliant. I know you have weekly columns with the Prince George Citizen, with Troy Media as well.
Troy Media, yeah.
Also for many years, Shaw Spotlight, Lessons in Learning, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I did read that article, but even before these recent articles, you've been talking about these subjects for a long time. I was listening to an article or a Shaw Spotlight YouTube series from 2015, and you were already talking about the importance of reconciliation and not forgetting about the past, and knowing that we do have dark chapters in Canadian history, but these are areas that we can learn from to move forward.
Right, and I think that's really a very important thing. I don't know, I get very concerned when I hear people writing things off without doing a little bit of digging, right? And maybe that comes because my mom's from Germany, right? My mom was born in 1931 in Germany.
So between the world wars.
Well, yeah, and she, she was just turning 14 when the war ended. And, just like any person, I think of my generation, we're like, okay, well, what happened with my grandparents at that time, right? I read a really, really good book recently called Learning from the Germans. And one of the things that the Germans have done, especially my generation, really, is look honestly and say, what were my grandparents doing? There's one woman who the movie Schindler's List, there's that crazy commandant who would shoot people just randomly. His granddaughter is black, and she wrote a book that said, my grandfather would have killed me or would have shot me, I think it's called. And just digging back into, who were our grandparents? How did this happen? What did people believe? And that's really, really, really important. And once you do that, then you can come to find the truth and say, okay, well, because I think, you know, especially for the Germans, these were my grandparents we're talking about here, right? These are my parents, these are my grandparents, these are my great-grandparents. This is my family. What did we do? What mistakes did we make, right? Were they really all bad? Arnold Schwarzenegger actually did a really cool piece on that as well, talking about his own father, and how he was damaged after World War II, being Austrian.
And Austria's role, yeah.
Yeah, and and talking about the other fathers in his neighborhood, they were damaged people because they'd gone along with something that was so horrendous. What can we learn from that, right? How can we look back and say, okay, that was really bad, right? What can we learn from that? And one of the things I often say to my students too, and this is where I get really, I don't know if queasy is the right word, but when people judge the past, people from the past without proper information, I say, well, what about us, right? What are people 50 or 100 years from now going to say about us, right?
Especially when it comes to people judging others in the present for events that happened far back in the past.
Right.
I look at, we've actually had two guests on this podcast that both lived through World War II.
Right.
Dick Von Eugene being one of them, John Brink the other.
Correct.
And two things that both of these gentlemen said when we were talking to them leading up to the interview, when we mentioned the war, was in reflection, looking back, whether it was the Germans or whether it was the Allies, that everyone was a victim. Everyone was a victim of this war.
Right.
And that's something that both these gentlemen said, and it really resonated with me because, I mean, it's not like you have some Nazi soldiers that are stationed in northeastern Holland that want to be there. You know, like I'm sure they'd rather be in Germany, living a life with their family in a non-war environment, right?
Yeah, and I think that's important to remember. But another thing too is, Viktor Frankl, I love, you read Man's Search for Meaning, eh?
Yes, thanks for the recommendation.
No, I honestly recommend that for everybody. I read it with my students every year.
Felt like it was a book just full of powerful quotes, one after another.
Really it is. But one of the things that Frankl said, and I think this is really important, and we, because I've had the privilege of meeting a number of Holocaust survivors, and for a long time, nobody wanted to talk about what they had gone through. They said, oh, we suffered too. And yeah, you did, but we need to look at this, right? We need to look at this. So that's the only caution I would say to that. But yeah, the suffering was universal, right? Mm-hmm. But we have to, I think, dig through that as well. And I think that's what the Germans are doing too, because, for generations of Germans, they would say they didn't want to talk about it. They wouldn't address it. They were like, we suffered too. But then, the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren look back and say, yeah, but we got to unearth some of this. Right?
Yeah. What is one thing that you took away from that book from Viktor Frankl? Is, I know there's the quote about the space between, when there's a stimulus and then a response. There's that space between. Right?
Yeah.
And that was one of numerous quotes. But what is one thing that you really took away from that book?
It's really hard to put it down to one, because I think about that book a lot. Probably because I've read it so many times, I can't even count the number of times I've read it. But that one is definitely one. That freedom. And what's funny about that, and I when I'm teaching the book to my students, I often say to them, that every time I read this book, I learn something new, right? Like I remember the first time I read that book in my 20s. I hadn't really dealt with many challenges in life. Life had been really, I was one of those lucky people, who had a really good life. So I didn't understand what he meant when he talked about the ultimate freedom is to choose one's response. So I would say, everybody's free. Don't talk to me about communism. Everybody's free. They still, and it was like I want to kick myself when I think of the things that I think of that perspective. And it's like I totally didn't get it. Right? I just totally didn't get it. And now that I've lived a little bit, and faced some challenges in life, it's like, yeah, And what I notice with my students too, with my grade 12s, is I say to the students, read it again when you're older, right? But the ones who come from, more challenging backgrounds, they get it,
Yeah.
They can relate to what's being said.
Yeah.
And you never know who's coming from a challenging background either.
You never do. And there's so many lessons to be learned throughout that book. And
Yeah.
even in subsequent interviews that Viktor Frankl has done over the years, and leading up to this podcast, I actually researched them quite a bit, knowing that you're a big fan of the author. And what really resonated strongly with me when he was talking about what drives people and the ultimate happiness. He talks about people that when they're on the pursuit of happiness, they're not going to find that. If their goal is to find happiness, you're not going to find
Right.
it. He says true happiness comes from purpose.
Yeah.
Finding your purpose, a meaningful purpose in life.
Absolutely.
And you see that with other people. I always think about Jim Good, who's also been a podcast guest, where from a young age, he always knew that botany and music were his two passions in life, and nothing else was as important as those. So he spent his entire life building Good Sir Nature Park, which is this amazing botanical park, as well as a music museum with over 35,000 records.
Right.
And that's what he focused on his entire life. And he's one of the happiest people I know.
Yeah.
Jim Tyrion's another example, a young gentleman who walked across Canada despite being deaf, and raised over $800,000 for the Terry Fox Foundation.
Wow.
Because his goal in life was to support his hero Terry Fox and the charitable foundation. The unfortunate thing, and you might agree with me, Gerry, is that a lot of people won't find that purpose or that meaning in life. They're too busy trying to find happiness, but happiness should be a byproduct, not a pursuit of finding that purpose.
Right. I talk about that a lot with my students, actually, because the last couple of years I've taught career education 8, and it really came to my attention. I was sitting at my desk one lunch hour, and this little girl from grade 8, she comes by my door and she goes, "Mr. Chidiac, why are you always so happy?" And I was like, I just love being a teacher, right? And I didn't really think about it. And then I did think of that quote from Frankl, that happiness must ensue, right? From a purpose greater than oneself. And that's what I share with my students as well. And I have my mission statement up on my wall, and I don't know if it's the most perfect mission statement, but it motivates me every day. And one of the points is to create happy memories for each student, and to inspire them to achieve their greatness. And that's really what drives me, right? Hopefully students' experience in my classroom is a happy experience, is a happy memory. I don't know if anybody achieves 100% on that, but
and that is a great mission statement.
Yeah.
And so at Duchess Park, what are you currently teaching? What subjects?
I teach social justice 12. I have 3 blocks of that this coming year. I teach German, so beginning and so 3 levels of German.
So 3 levels of German.
Right. And
is that coming from your background of speaking multiple languages? French,
that's right.
German,
because
and
I grew up in a bilingual home. We spoke German at home. My grandmother used to spend time with us and never spoke English, so we had to learn German, and we spent some time in Germany with her. And that really had a profound impact on me as well. The other side of my family, I go to like meetings with German teachers, and they'll look at my name. Chidiac, das ist kein deutscher Name. That's no German name. And my dad is Syrian. My grandparents actually were Syrian refugees.
Wow.
In the early part of the 20th century, fleeing the Ottomans as Christians. So, and that's another thing that makes me extremely grateful for Canada, is to be so welcomed here. But yeah, so that's both sides of the family, Syrian and German. But I don't speak Arabic, unfortunately, but I do speak German. And so I teach German, and then I work with the at-risk students a bit, and we
That's right. Yeah,
yeah.
you work with a lot of at-risk students, and you also work with a lot of Indigenous students, because
Right.
a lot of people might not realize that School District 57 has the greatest proportion of Indigenous students compared to any other district in British Columbia.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, and so, and that's been really good. That has, like when I look at my evolution as a teacher, my growth as a teacher, my growth in the years I spent at Duchess Park, our Aboriginal Education Department has provided some pretty amazing formation and opportunities for growth. And, you know, I was just reflecting on this because I'm taking a master's course on, in education. And, you know, reflecting on the growth, on my growth since I graduated from Teachers College in '85 and where we were at, and, you know, the significance of like Stephen Harper's apology in 2008, to make that meaningful, right, has been very challenging, right? But it requires all of us. And learning Indigenous ways of teaching and learning has made me a better teacher. It really has. And to be open to that. And, you know, another book I'd recommend for anybody especially in northern BC, but really anywhere in Canada or maybe even in the world, is Mary John's book by Bridget Moran, Stony Creek Woman. That is, you know, it shows its age a little bit because you don't use the name Stony Creek anymore, but it's a really, really good book written by a brilliant and wonderful and resilient elder, Mary John. It's really extraordinary, actually. It's just a little book, too. It's a quick read, but an extraordinary book.
Great.
How did I get on that topic? Oh, you're talking about our Indigenous education. Yeah. And, you know, another thing that really has impacted me, and again, I would encourage anybody to reflect on the 7 sacred teachings, the 7 grandfather teachings. Because what I've started to do now is, you know, you face uncertainties in life and we don't always know the right thing to do. And what I've been able to do now, it's really given me a very valuable tool, is I reflect on the 7 grandfather teachings of humility, right? What's the humble thing to do here, right? What's the honest thing to do here? What's the respectful thing to do here? What's the courageous thing to do here? You know, am I seeking truth? Am I seeking wisdom? You know, and ultimately, is it the loving thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. And that is just such a powerful just way of processing decisions. You know, so that's what I mean. It's not only made me a better teacher, it's made me a better person to, you know, because it really cuts to the chase, right? It really does. These are the things that are really important.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
You know, so.
Yeah. So backing up a little bit, what inspired you to be a teacher? Did you always know from a young age that you wanted to teach?
No,
Is it something you stumbled upon?
You know, I joke with my students about that too, because like when we do career education, you know, they do some, you know, searching for different jobs and, you know, what kind of interest, personality type, and so on. And I say to my students that, you know, when I did this test when I was in high school, what came up? Catholic teaching sister is what came up on mine. And I'm like, what? That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Like, it was the last thing I wanted to do. You know, I thought I wanted to fly airplanes or something at that time, right? But as I was going through high school, and even in university, I ended up, you know, doing summer jobs like at summer camps, and, you know, growing up in Toronto, I worked for the Y and for, you know, the City of Toronto playground programs, organizing sports and activities for kids in the city in the summertime. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So I was finishing up my degree in social science with a minor in cross-cultural studies, which was really, really awesome.
Yeah.
It really was. It really, you know, broadened my worldview. But I was like, okay, you know what? Teaching sounds kind of cool. And, you know, because like I say, I realized that I really enjoyed working with young people. So that's what I did. And but it wasn't until probably my last year of university where I really seriously thought about education.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it took to the last year of university to really put that nail in the coffin, saying,
Yeah.
you know what, this teaching thing might really work.
Yeah, and then then you do it and you realize, yeah, this really makes me want to get out of bed in the morning. This is really, I love doing this.
Absolutely.
And
our last guest on the podcast was Don Chamberlain, who was the principal of Kelly Road Secondary School for many years, over 20. And it was really a direct reflection for me as a host, as well as Dave Mothis, just to kind of reflect on our own high school experience and think about all the influential figures, whether it be classmates or teachers or parents or volunteers that played a role in our high school experience. And it was really just a fun exercise to think back and be thankful of all these teachers that helped us along the way. And I feel like you play that role for hundreds and hundreds of students of yearly, the students that might be in your class or students that you might just see at the school.
Right.
What does it feel for you to be in a position to influence others positively and help them along their path of figuring out what they want to do in this crazy lifetime?
Well, honestly, I think that is the greatest joy of teaching. It really, and that's the nice thing about living in a community like Prince George. It's where I can have contact with, people whom I see them all the time, people I used to teach. Like I'm going to the dentist on Monday, and the dentist is a former student. I'm going to the eye doctor on Thursday. The eye doctor is a former student, right? Sonny, who works with you, is a former student. I taught him in grade 5. Jordan Yu played basketball for me, right? And it's really cool to, like, even when I'm teaching, and so I use that when I'm teaching as well. And I say to my students, you're going to go on to do great things. I have been at this job for over 30 years. And I see what my former students are doing, and it's awesome. Yeah. It's awesome.
What an honorable experience for you, just to be able to witness, being in the school district for over 30 years as a teacher, to witness former students go on to great things.
Yeah.
It's also got to be hard. I mean, like, say you go down to Pine Center Mall to pick a few things up. Like, do you ever have teachers that are kind of waving at you and you're like, ooh, did I teach him or her?
Well, you know what? I grew up in Toronto, so I don't have that problem.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's, I don't even see my... But, you mean ones who didn't like me, or?
Oh, no, just former students that you might not recognize.
Oh, that happens to me as well, yeah. But you know what? I've learned to be honest about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'll say, did I teach you? Right? Yeah. Because the thing is, they grow up, and especially, like, having taught elementary school, because I taught at Immaculate Conception, that's where I taught Sonny, right? Mm-hmm. I recognize, you really, really get to know those people, right? Like Jordan Yu, I taught in grade 5 as well, and he played basketball for me. And, so you remember those people fairly easily, but they grow up and you don't always necessarily recognize them, right? Mm-hmm. What I realize is people's eyes don't change, right? So sometimes, like especially the people I taught in elementary school, if I look in their eyes, I can say, oh, I remember you,
then it
right?
clicks.
Yeah. But high school is challenging because, you're teaching a couple hundred people a year, right? And if I've only taught somebody, like this past year, I had, my grade 8s, I had them for like 11 days. And because of COVID, we had, quarter system, and so I'd have them for the full afternoon for 11 days. And it's really, really hard to get to know people with that, right? Yeah. And I found that very challenging, actually. So in that way, it's, I feel embarrassed, honestly, when I can't remember people's names. And I think, what's one area of growth that I have to start to, where I need to go, and it's to learn to remember people's names better.
Yeah, well, it's good that you're honest about it if you can't remember.
Right,
So, Gerry, another question I actually wanted to ask was, what has it been like being a teacher within the school district during a global pandemic? I know that a lot of students, when they were sent home and classes were temporarily shut down, that some of them maybe didn't come back.
Yeah, we lost a lot. And I'm very concerned about that. And I don't know what we're going to do.
So you did lose quite a few students?
We did, and we did, especially our at-risk kids, right? That they, and so I don't know where they are. We don't know where they are, and that's a global issue.
Yeah, that's not just Prince George.
That's not just
right?
Prince George.
Yeah.
That's a global issue. So we need to be thinking. And I don't know. I'm not in the admin office, right? So I don't know what the plan is to bring those students back. You know, if I could give my input, I'd say, well, let's, you know, develop an outreach program. Let's even give them a couple more years to finish high school, right? And that, I would see that as actually maybe a good thing, because a lot of times our at-risk kids, if they had a couple extra years to finish high school, you know, that's often a good thing, because I don't know about, you know, cutting people loose at 18.
Yeah.
You know?
No, definitely not.
You know,
Yeah.
and so I'm not saying we're cutting them loose, but sometimes it feels like that, and I'm like, you know, did we serve that person the best that we could?
Yeah,
Right.
a valid question.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a lot of former students of yours that would look back at their high school career, and when they think about their favorite teachers, you'd be at the top of that list. Can you think about some of your favorite teachers growing up, or maybe one in particular that stood out and helping develop you to the person you are today?
Well, that's kind of interesting, actually. You know, I don't know if he was one of my favorite people when I was going through high school, but there was this, I went to a Catholic high school, and there was this priest, Father Allison, and he was like, you know, 5'3", and he had these beady blue eyes, and he'd stare at you and pull your soul out of you, you know, like we were all scared of him.
Sounds intense. Yeah.
He was, but you know what? He was a really, because it's kind of funny, because he taught German, right? And he taught, like he called it cultures in conflict, which in the late 70s, that's how old I am, going through high school in the late 70s, to develop a course on genocide studies. Really, he called it Holocaust, or no, it was, people called it Holocaust, and he said, no, it's cultures in conflict. Because it was more than just the Holocaust, because we not only read, you know, studied the Holocaust, we studied, and this again was very revolutionary. We read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and looked at the Indigenous issue of how Indigenous people were taught way back then, when nobody was really talking about it. So he was very forward thinking. So in that sense, he really had an impact on me, you know. And he was a good teacher. He was a tough teacher. But the course material that he taught really got me thinking. And you know, I like to think I'm a little bit more chill than Father Allison was, but he was a really, really good teacher. He really was, you know. And actually, I am in contact with some of his, with a couple of his nephews on LinkedIn, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
You know, I can say hi to Uncle Bruce for me.
Those are some of the positives of social media, when you can reconnect with old colleagues and acquaintances.
It's really
and friends.
cool, actually. Yeah. It's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Gerry, you spent some time in the Congo. I really want to talk about this because, like, probably one of the most dangerous places in the world.
Right.
When you look at some of the statistics. I mean, when you think about the amount of child soldiers that they produce, when you think about the arms races and arms conflict. I was reading a stat last night that was saying that in terms of armed conflict post World War II, there's been over 5.5 million deaths, which is more in a single country than any other country in the world since World War II, including Vietnam.
And we often don't talk about that, right? And we don't, you know, and that's, you know, and here in the North, we don't, you know, like mining industry is really important. And I've actually challenged, you know, some of our members of parliament on this issue too, like, you know, conflict minerals. Are Canadian mining companies contributing to the problem there? Yeah, right.
Because they're very resource heavy in terms of gold and tin and other natural resources.
Correct. Now that's on the other side of the country where I was. I was in Kinshasa, the capital.
Oh, okay.
Now that's not to say that things were super nice in Kinshasa. It was pretty intense then.
Yeah. So is that where you learned French then? Because I believe that's the second largest French-speaking population in the world, next to Paris.
No, it is larger than Paris.
It's larger than Paris.
Larger than Paris, yeah. Wow. And yes, Kinshasa is that. You've done your homework. That's really good. So I'm impressed. That's really, most people don't know that, right? But it is. But no, I learned French in Montreal. I went I studied in Montreal with the intention of going to the Congo. And
How
then when
was
I was,
the differences in the language there between Montreal French and then French in the Congo? Were there?
there's a few differences,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure, and you have to get used to that. Like
Yeah.
I remember, I said to somebody, peux-tu barrer la porte, which is what they would say in Quebec, which means literally bar the door. Will you bar the door? And he looked at me like, you want me to do what, right? On ferme la porte à clé, right? And you say it in French. So there's certain phrases like that.
And I guess dialects too, because there was over 200 different dialects and different languages
Right.
in the Congo.
And I learned Lingala, right? I wouldn't say I became proficient in Lingala, but I did learn Lingala, which was a lot of fun, actually. And it's fun now because I remember one time, this is a really good Prince George story. I was standing in line at Overweighty, and I heard these two Congolese guys talking behind me.
Yeah.
And so I turned around and I said, Pino bo baka Lingala? Ngai pe na lo baka Lingala. I said, you guys speak Lingala? I speak Lingala too, right? And they're like, Overweighty and Prince George's guy speaking Lingala, right? It was really, so we had a great laugh. We really, they were just like,
What are the chances?
what are the chances?
Yeah.
And just, it was really a lot of fun. So yeah, I learned Lingala as well, but we spoke, French was kind of the language of business there, and, the work language. And
So what was your primary reason for being there?
I was working at a home for street kids.
Oh, wow.
It was called L'œuvre de réclassement et protection des enfants de la rue, ORPER, O-R-P-E-R.
Yeah. And this was with the Canadian government? Or?
Actually, no, that was with the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Though the Canadian government was really, really good to us.
Yeah.
They were very good to us when we were there. The ambassador at the time, he and his wife were big supporters of the work that we were doing. If we needed anything, we would go to the embassy, and and I hung out with the Vandus, who were their bodyguards. A couple of there were a group of Vandus there who were bodyguards. And we played softball together on Saturdays and stuff. It was really,
Yeah.
it was really good.
So were there times where you ever felt unsafe? Or
Oh,
you
absolutely.
saw situations, where you're like, okay, we're definitely not in Canada anymore.
Absolutely, yeah. Like it was the end of Mobutu's regime, right? Mobutu was the dictator at that time, and so there were a couple times when there was looting going on, and I remember at one point I actually did get evacuated because the Canadian embassy said, well, we're going to ask you, I'd only been there a couple months, and they said, well, we're going to ask you to leave because if anything happened, we can't be responsible for you, right?
Yeah, when you're hearing that, something's up.
Right. So, I did return back a few months later, not according to the recommendation, but I did return because I really enjoyed what I was doing there, and it was very meaningful for me. So I returned and finished out my stint there, and I worked with some of the finest educators when I was there. And again, I found a lot of them on Facebook. And
what a learning experience!
It was
right?
amazing.
Just, taking in different culture, different knowledge, and
Yeah.
you're basically forced to learn the language as well, right?
Right.
Where it's not just an option, or you can study at your own will, like to actually ingrain yourself into the communities that you're in.
Well,
in Congo.
I had to be fluent in French
Yeah.
in order to work there.
Did you find that a lot of the residents were actually respectful of that, the fact that you were putting in that effort to learn?
Oh
the
yeah,
language?
they were. That was one thing. I don't know what it is about collective memory, but as soon as the Congolese knew that you were there as a missionary, as I was, they were just so nice.
Yeah.
It was there were a couple of times when it was a little bit intense, right? Like I remember there were a group of guys. But the thing is, the Congolese, and sometimes I'll hear people say, how would those, we have to be so nice to the immigrants, right? Well, what if we were there? And I said, actually, the people there are so nice to you, right? And they'll watch out for you. Like the people there really watched out for me, because when you're the white guy walking around Kinshasa, and I did walk a lot more than most foreigners, people were always watching out for me and making sure I was okay, you know. And I remember one time I was walking down the street, and I don't know, a group of guys that I don't know why they just didn't. Well, I can understand why there's a lot of animosity toward colonialists there, because, you know, we talk about the situation in the Congo today. Well, King Leopold basically made, the Belgian King Leopold, it was the first genocide of the 20th century, what he did there. He wiped out, millions of people in the Congo Free State. It was like, if you read Heart of Darkness, you know, some people read Conrad's Heart of Darkness and say, well, that's dark. That was the reality under Leopold, right? And a lot of people don't realize that. So, but so anyhow, there was a group of people who, for whatever reason, didn't like me. But somebody right away said, right away came to bat for me. He said, "Yeah, Zasango, he's a missionary," and the guys backed off immediately.
Wow.
So they were, I don't know, the Congolese were just so good to me. I'm just so grateful to the people there. They really, I don't know, they even though I was struggling with the language, the Lingala, and made mistakes, and
So did your time in the Congo actually kind of spark your interest in future teachings in subjects such as genocide and social justice? I mean, a lot of people look at whether it's genocide or cultural genocide as something that's far off in the past, but it's still happening
it's
today.
still happening,
you look
very
at,
much so.
Yeonnomi Park, who is an escapee from North Korea.
Okay.
And she's been making a circuit right now on various podcasts, Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, Jordan Peterson, and her story is scary. Like just hearing what she has to say about what's happening in North Korea today, and explaining the people there that know no other world.
Right.
They just think that that's normal life. They don't have internet, they don't have running water, they don't have food, and to think that there's millions of people that are going through starvation on a daily basis. I mean, that's just another form of genocide.
Right.
And so your time in the Congo, did that actually spark your interest in teaching the subject down the road?
I think it did. I think it did, yeah. What really sparked my interest, though, was actually visiting relatives in Germany, right? Because, again, going back to that topic, I was, it was
And
around
what
Christmas.
age?
I was in my early 30s, I think.
Yeah.
It was in the early 90s at this.
So a lot of conversations with relatives about
just
the Holocaust, World War II.
No, actually, it was just the fact that we were having a good time together, right? And they're just wonderful people.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Everywhere I've gone in the world, there's wonderful people. There's just really, really wonderful people.
Absolutely.
But I was having a wonderful time, right? And I just remember looking around saying, these are great people. How did something so horrendous happen here?
Yeah.
And so I just started asking that question. And what I came to realize is that it not only happened there, it happened here, right? Like in Canada, we're dealing with our own genocide, right? And it happened in the Congo, and it's happening today, right?
Rwanda, Cambodia, Khmer Rouge.
Yeah. But even, look at what's happening in Yemen, and we're completely ignoring that. Look at, the COVID vaccines. Like, we've been very fortunate that there haven't been outbreaks of COVID in refugee camps. Like, why aren't we vaccinating these people, right? Yeah. Just so things are happening in the world today that we really need to look at. So it's not something that just happened. It's, whenever we forget the humanity of our neighbor, that we have problems, right?
And that can go back to Viktor Frankl, what he talked about in his book, where I think there is a quote from Sigmund Freud, where he talked about how whenever there would be hunger involved, that's when all humans are equal, whenever they're facing hunger. But this was refuted by Viktor Frankl, because he said that what he witnessed in those Holocaust camps was that there might be somebody who was starving to death that had one small half piece of bread left, and he'd give it to the person
Right.
next to him. And then there'd be another person that would actually stab his brother to death to
Right.
get his last piece of bread.
Right.
So he kind of refuted Freud, saying
He
that,
did.
well, that's actually not the case. You're going to have all different
Right.
levels of humanity during pretty hard situations
Right.
like that.
And within each one of us as well.
Mhm.
And I love that quote, and I think we really need to remember that. It's one that I don't know. I think I've probably quoted it a number of times in my columns, that there's no good there, or he said there's only two races of men, and excuse the sexist language, but it was written in the 40s, right? But he says there's only two races of people, the decent and the indecent, and they're all found in every group. And then he continues on, and in each one of us, is it any surprise that in each one of us there's a combination of good and bad,
Yeah.
right? Which goes back to that Cherokee story of the two wolves as well, right? So we're all, struggling with that good and bad, and trying to feed the good wolf and,
Yeah.
and be the best that we can be.
I think
right?
that's why forgiveness is such a huge area that people need to focus on more, because you look at somebody that may have made a mistake, say back in 1995, and they still might be thinking about that mistake. Here we are in 2021,
Right.
and thinking that mistake might provide a large part of their identity still. But people grow, and people turn,
Yeah.
like, who you are today is a different person than who you were a
Right.
year ago or 20 years ago, or
Right.
maybe even a week ago. And so that's why I feel like forgiveness is such a good trait to allow yourself to entertain with different people, and yourself,
Right.
especially. I just want to go back to talking about when you visited your relatives in Germany, because there's something I always thought about growing up as a kid, and I became very interested in the world wars, and I started studying them like before I even jumped into the high school classes in grade 11 for social studies. And it was that my best friend growing up was from Germany, and he was on my soccer team, and he was my best friend for 20 plus years. And I always thought to myself, like, if we're living in 1939,
I know.
between 1939 and 1945, we could be enemies
I know.
trying to kill each other. Or if we're living in the late of 1915, 1919, like, we could be in separate trenches,
Yeah.
trying to take over land against each other. And I always thought about that, because my best friend was German. Here I
Yeah.
was as a Canadian. And if this was a different generation, it could have been a different story.
Isn't it? It's so arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
It really, really is. The differences, and I think that's what we need to see our common humanity, and that's a beautiful point. It reminds me of there's a really good movie. It's called Merry Christmas, Joyeux Noël, and it's about the 1914 truce in World War I,
Yeah.
where they came out of the trenches and they played
The soccer on
Play-
Christmas
yeah.
Eve, I think,
Yeah.
or Christmas Day. Yeah.
and because that's what we are, right? And what's ironic is that those soldiers, the British, the French, and the German soldiers who were playing soccer together actually had more in common with each other
Yeah.
than they had with their commanders.
Yeah. Can you imagine just being in a trench in 1914
Yeah.
and in northern France, and all of a sudden you're putting down all your guns and any kind
Yeah.
of firearms, or and then just playing a game of soccer, and then the next day
I know.
having to go back to fight in war?
Yeah, it's so twisted.
Yeah.
It really is. And I think we need to keep that in mind with one another,
Mhm.
right? Like,
Especially if you look at something like a proxy war, like Vietnam, where you have soldiers. There's a famous Bruce Springsteen song, and it's on one of his live albums, and he talks about the song's called "The River," and it's a live album, and for about 6 minutes, like, he's such a good storyteller,
Right,
Bruce Springsteen.
right.
He talks about Vietnam, and how, like, his dad was always giving him a hard time because he had long hair, and he's always saying, you're going to go nowhere in your life. And so he went and enlisted for Vietnam, and he did his physical, and then he failed, and he had to come back to his house and tell his dad, saying, like, I failed my physical, I'm so ashamed. And then his dad saying, I'm proud of you for failing, because he didn't want his son to go away. And then the drummer in Bruce Springsteen's band at the time was enlisted and going to Vietnam. And Bruce Springsteen says, I remember talking to my drummer, and he didn't even know where Vietnam was. He said he was so scared, saying, here's like a 19-year-old kid saying, I'm going to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Where is Vietnam?
Yeah.
And then why are we fighting this war?
yeah,
So a byproduct of the Cold War for sure, but it was a proxy war where you had essentially kids
Yeah.
leaving their home and going to a foreign country that they have no
Right.
idea where it even is on the world
Right,
map.
right. Yeah.
But I think we should jump out of the war subject, and I want to talk about the Philippines.
Okay.
Because did you spent time
I
in the
spent a year in the
Philippines?
Philippines.
Yeah. What was
Yeah.
that like? What was that kind of experience?
That was awesome. I was in university, third year university, and the university I was going to had a exchange program to the Philippines, and that just opened my eyes so much because, like I said, I was doing social science with a concentration in cross-cultural studies, basically, and to study another culture while you're living in another culture
Doesn't get any better.
I know it was so eye-opening, right?
Yeah.
And it really made me reflect on, what really. It really helped me to see our commonality of human beings, and again, the Filipinos were just absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
But it also taught me to appreciate the freedom that we have in Canada, because I was living there during Marcos's era, right? The dictatorship of Marcos. And it was the first time that I was in a university class where people were weighing their words carefully because they didn't want to offend anybody.
Where there could be repercussions.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And pretty serious
Yeah.
ones. Yeah.
Or even, riding in a taxi with somebody, and they were like, "Shh, can't talk about that now."
Yeah.
Because you don't know where there's an informant and so on. It was,
But
like,
you won't, we're talking about this right now. Those are life experiences that you carry with you forever.
yeah,
And then what it does is it elevates a sense of gratitude when you're living in a beautiful country like Canada, and you recognize on a daily basis the substantial amount of freedoms that we're able to enjoy every day.
and that's, that's really why I write my columns,
Yeah.
right? Because I can, right?
Because you can.
My grandfather could not do that
Yeah.
in Germany, right? He would have got arrested,
Yeah. Have
And
you ever
so-
talked about that in a column? The fact that
Yeah,
you can actually produce them, and your grandfather would have been in a jail for doing the same kind of thing?
I have actually.
Yeah.
I did, and because I was reflecting on, on my grandfather, and maybe I was a little bit hard on him, saying that going along with this government, but at the same time, he got himself in some trouble under the Nazis, and because he was outspoken, and I think I have some of that in me
You
as
have a
well.
lot of that. That's a good. That's a compliment.
Well, thank you. Yeah, but so and he was a school teacher as well. So I'm probably a lot like my grandfather, and I couldn't imagine having to live under such an oppressive system where I couldn't say what I was thinking,
Yeah.
right? And couldn't challenge authority, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, so yeah, when you've lived in other places, when you reflect on what's going on in other places, what went on in other places, we realize how fortunate we are in Canada. Like really, and especially in a place like Prince George, right? Like I can run into Todd Doherty in the parking lot at Home Depot, which I've done, and start discussing, first of all, I really appreciate, our local representatives. I think, even though I might not always vote for them,
Yeah.
I appreciate the fact that we can have that dialogue.
Those
And I
conversations.
recognize how fortunate we are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And even, to be able to run into my member of parliament, or he's not my member of parliament, Bob Zimmer's.
Yeah.
But anyhow, but even, to run into Bob Zimmer, right? To be on a first name basis, and with Shirley Bond, right? To be on a first name basis with these people and be able to talk and be able to disagree is wonderful.
Yeah.
Right?
Like being able in a altruistic manner to disagree, and to being able to actually hold a conversation and respectfully disagree is a very powerful thing.
It is.
I have a friend from the States that actually they have a bunch of Prince George friends on their social media channels, and there was an election, I think it was city count municipal back in 2018, and they're kind of keeping an eye on things, and they said, like, your politics in Canada seems so boring. And
Yeah.
I was like, that's the best compliment ever,
Yeah.
right? Because boring can be synonymous with respectful as well. And what you said about, whether it's Todd Doherty or Shirley Bond, who was actually the first ever podcast
Right.
guest.
That was a good podcast. That was really good.
Really great podcast. It's, like, we're lucky to have these politicians, and to me, I don't care what party they belong to. I respect the fact that they're good people that do great things, that care about their community.
Right.
And you always see them at different events, helping out nonprofit organizations, or just getting behind that kind of community spirit that makes Prince George so great. And I was watching actually a debate, I think it was Lester Pearson and Mulroney, or some from the early 1980s, and like, they were dealing with some pretty hot topics at the time and some election issues, but they were so respectful.
Yeah.
Like, they're very respectful in their tone and their conversation with each other, and most importantly, how they listen to the other person.
Right.
And it's not uncommon to see politics today, especially south of the border, where it's who can talk over the other person.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And not listen to understand, but already have their mind made up on how they're going to respond.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. And I hope that we maintain that in Canada. And again, that's one of the reasons why I write my columns. It's not to say that I'm always right, And
you are writing about some pretty touchy subjects. Do you ever get backlash, or do you?
I do, for sure.
But does that turn into actually like good dialogue, good correspondence with people, or do you get people that already have their mind made up and they're lashing out?
Well, I don't know. I generally don't reply to people because, I talked to Godboot, and he said, well, you've had your platform, and this is people responding to it. I prefer that you didn't, engage and argue with them, in the dialogue boxes. My brother will, though.
He's just like, let's get it on.
Yeah. He doesn't use Chidiac, but he just goes, but he'll engage and make a point with certain people on certain topics. And I'm freer writing and things than I do teaching as well. Like teaching, I'll avoid certain topics because they're controversial, right? Like for example, Rwanda. I'll weigh my words. Well, not so much now because the French have actually apologized to Rwanda. They've been open about their role in the Rwandan genocide. But for years, I would be like, I think the French are responsible, but I don't want to say that, right? Because it's a contra. And when you're a teacher, you have to be really careful, right? So, but at the same time, I want my students to have their opinions, and I want them to research their opinions, and I want them to debate respectfully with each other. So,
but you don't shy away from contentious topics, which I think is really important, and especially for the next generations, because if we don't talk about these things, then that's worse than having these difficult conversations. And even with these, unmarked graves that we're finding across the nation, a lot of people are embarrassed to be Canadian. A lot of people are talking about this being the darkest chapter in not just Canadian history, but one of the darkest in the world. But there's also silver linings to all of these discoveries, because it's making people educate themselves. It's making, especially future generations that may have had no idea. They may have lived their entire life as a Canadian and had no idea, or at least a little understanding about the residential school system and the not just the cultural genocide, but genocide as a whole that this did to our nation. It was, killing the Indian and the child, which is basically the mantra. And you were talking about this years ago in your Shaw Spotlight specials, and I found that really remarkable, that you were really trying hard to bring awareness and attention to this difficult subject during a time where it wasn't popular to do so.
It's kind of funny actually with that too. I've kind of looked back at some of my older columns and said, oh, I guess I was kind of cutting edge there,
ahead of the times.
And so, but I think, I don't know, it's always a pursuit of truth, right? That's the most important thing for me is to pursue truth. And
so do you think about, when you're writing your columns, is pursuit of truth kind of top of mind? Like that's what you're going after? When you're
absolutely. And when I'm teaching as well, pursuit of truth. And the willingness to be wrong, right? To risk being wrong is...
it's wild how many people are afraid of being wrong. Like being wrong is not necessarily a horrific thing.
No.
You should look at it as a learning experience rather as a fault.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's so I don't know. I just try to, Dr. King. I always think of what Dr. King used to say, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, right? And I've seen that in my lifetime. Actually, a really cool story where I kind of saw that, and I did. It ties in with Prince George, because one of my co-workers at Dutchess Park is a refugee from El Salvador.
Oh, wow.
Right, and his family immigrated here in the 90s, and I said to him, actually, I said, the issue in your country was the first social justice issue that drew my attention as a young person. And I remember, I grew up in Toronto, going to rallies at like Queen's Park in Toronto, and Ed Broadbent speaking. And I would write letters to my member of parliament, who was a conservative, Michael Wilson, who was one of the architects of NAFTA. But what I really appreciated, and this is one of the things.
Was this in the early 80s?
This was in the early 80s, yeah. And one of the things I appreciate, again, about our members of parliament and about our Canadian political system, Michael Wilson, I was just this young punk, right, saying, writing to you, but respectfully responding to my messages, right, to my letters to him. That is our Canadian system. And I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney, despite what the Americans said, brought in a number of refugees from El Salvador, from Central America in the late 80s and early 90s. And my friend Juan was one of them, right? And now he's here in Prince George, making our community a better place. And it was just so cool, that moment where you realize that, the little things, I don't know if it had anything to do with Juan being here, but it could have.
It could have, absolutely.
And
how sensational.
It is, to know that the little things that you do, don't hesitate to do something good for somebody else. You never know what impact that's going to have, right? So, yeah, it's, I guess, but dealing with the Indigenous issues in Prince George, I would like to see. I feel tremendous gratitude to the Lheidli T'enneh. I really do, and I hope that comes out in what I write. Because here I am, the grandchild of refugees, welcome in one of the most beautiful parts of the world, right? I don't get a little bit choked up here, but it's true. I sincerely feel that tremendous gratitude, and we have to make this right, right? And I don't know how we're going to make this right, and I honestly say that to my students as well, because there's so much we don't know. And I don't have all the answers. And so I say to my students, especially my grade 12s, is you guys are our new leaders, right? You're going to do great things. You're going to make this better, And I sincerely believe that. I'm getting all choked up, sorry.
You're absolutely right, though, Gerry. I mean, it starts with education. It starts with listening. And it starts with respect. It starts with all these foundational elements. And I look back at National Indigenous Peoples Day at Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park, and we had a large representation from the Indigenous population, and they were drumming and they were singing, and they were paying tributes, and I remember one thing that really stood out for me that I heard that day was there was a young Indigenous man that was at the microphone and saying that we should still feel proud to be Canadian, that we should always feel proud to be Canadian.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we should neglect this dark chapter in our nation's history.
Well, I think we have a tremendous responsibility to the world, actually. And this is where the honesty of our history, let's deal with it honestly, but realize too that this is a global issue, right? Like, one of my students actually it's amazing what students will come up with. I was talking about the importance of reconciliation and so on, and this one student goes, Mr. Chidiac, what about the English? And I said, I really don't want to answer that question. But
yeah, prima nocta.
What?
Is it the prima nocta with the English and the Scottish?
Well, it goes back to that,
Yeah.
right? It really does. You go back to the Irish, you go back to the British Empire, right? You go to India.
Yeah.
I really don't want to touch that issue in the classroom. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's but
There's
maybe
a lot
I
of
should.
examples.
There are a lot of examples, right? And so what we're doing is very important, right? And again, looking at what the Germans have taught us by reconciling. And the Germans have now realized that, okay, what we did in the Holocaust was really bad.
Mm-hmm.
Our support for the Armenian genocide was really bad.
Yeah.
What we did in Namibia was genocidal. We need to apologize for that, Mm-hmm. So the Germans are actually on the cutting edge of all the, we have a hurting world.
Yeah.
We really do. But we're all part of the healing process as well, and I think we need to embrace that and not be afraid of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Post Second World War Germany was an interesting time too. I think it was a U.S. Operation Paperclip, it might have been called. It was some kind of moniker for the operation. But what they did when there was all of a sudden a race with other countries, especially Russia, to recruit all the German engineers.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and I was reading an article about that. That was just like that was the primary focus subsequent to World War II was like how many of these brilliant German engineers can we recruit to be on our team?
Wow.
And that was what kind of manifested into this 5-decade Cold War. A lot of talk about war. I want to go back to the teaching just a little bit.
Right.
During, I think it was a Shaw Spotlight session, you briefly mentioned that you had a learning disability. It might have been in one of your articles. Did you want to talk about that?
Well, it was, I don't know, largely undiagnosed. But yeah, a little bit of, I think we would call it I'm mildly dyslexic now, I think. And I say that to my students as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I still read very slowly,
Mm-hmm.
compared to most people with a...
Probably gain a better understanding.
Well,
that
hopefully. I realize, though, that, audiobooks are actually the best way for me to read.
It's amazing.
It really is.
For productivity.
Yeah.
In terms of being able to get other things done simultaneously to take in knowledge from an audiobook, I'm a huge advocate for audiobooks. I absolutely love them. Prior to this year, I was lucky if I'd finish a book a month.
Yeah.
Like really lucky, and I'd have to put in the time to actually sit down and crank out those pages.
Yeah.
Now I'm going through 1 to 2 books a week because I always have an audiobook playing. If it's at the gym in the morning, if it's during a commute, if it's when I'm eating lunch or dinner. There's so many different possibilities, even just 45 minutes before falling asleep at night. And you can just cruise through all these different books. And like with Audible, actually, Andrew, our producer and recorder here, he got me onto this Audible app where you can get free credits every month and you can just take in all these different books. It's really, really cool. One book that I recommend that I think that you would really enjoy is, it talks about these Spanish settlers. It's called A Land So Strange. And it talks about the generation of Spanish explorers after Christopher Columbus. So it was one generation after Christopher Columbus, and it talks about how all of a sudden, the race was on. We discovered this new land. Let's go over and see if we can actually settle there. So there's this one boat of 400 people that came over from Spain, and they're looking for kind of like the Gulf of Mexico area. And so they landed in Florida, so not their direct intended destination of the Gulf of Mexico, which was a little bit more south. And so they landed in Florida, and they thought, well, maybe this is an island, and maybe if we just keep on heading inwards, we'll get to the other side of the island. And so it tells a story how this party of 400 people turned into 4. And it just became this massive
Wow.
act of survival, and with the indigenous tribes, and some were friendly and some weren't. The wildlife, it wasn't, you think North American wildlife, you think what's going to be the largest predator or the most ubiquitous predator? You think bears, but it was actually mountain lions at
Huh.
that time. Yeah, like you think
Wow.
like Florida, like pumas and
Yeah, yeah.
and panthers, and essentially the same thing as the mountain lion. And it just talks about like all of the parties' horrific experiences of starvation and the wildlife and the tribes. And the 4 people that survived were the ones that were the most educated in the medical field. So the ones that they actually became healers, and then they were taken in by the indigenous tribes, and then they became people of worship. And so one of the 4 was a slave. And I think he was from some part of Africa, but he ended up becoming this massive healer. And it shows how the 10 years that they spent ingraining themselves into these North American lifestyles, that they are passed from tribe to tribe to tribe as healers. And then once, after 10 years, another Spanish party found them, this slave who became this healer that was just worshipped by so many different indigenous tribes throughout North America went back to being a slave. So it was just a very tumultuous, ride, but it's a really great audiobook that I think you would like.
Yeah.
So sorry to get off topic there. Back to the teaching. I also want to touch on one thing. Andrew, who's right here beside us recording this episode, you taught Andrew as well.
Well, we worked together at camp.
Together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was that like?
Well, we worked at Camp Maurice. So that's the Catholic summer camp in Fort St. James.
Yeah.
And I guess as a teacher, in the summertime you have something to offer, so you run summer camps. But Andrew did a wonderful job. Danny Brock, who taught at O'Grady, another former Frontier Apostle, used to run these teen camps, and then passed on the torch to Andrew.
Awesome.
And Andrew did a great job with those teen camps with my own kids.
Nice. And so are your own kids still in Prince George then, or?
2 of them are. One of them's a musician in Vancouver, and the other 2 are here in town. My youngest is finishing up at UNBC.
Nice.
Yeah.
What an asset that university is to
it is.
our community. I mean, I think we're at 31 years now since its inception in 1990, and it's hard to imagine Prince George or Northern BC as a whole without UNBC.
Yeah. Well, when I think of how Prince George has changed since I moved here in 1985, the university has been a huge driver for change. It's really made the community much, much better. It's people used to have to go all the way to Vancouver to get a university education, and now you can do it right here in town. And just that's made it's had such a positive impact on our community.
Yeah,
it really has.
Rewarding as a teacher as well, because when you arrived in the mid '80s, probably for the first decade of your teaching career, you saw students leave the community and probably never come back, like after grade 12.
Yeah, oftentimes, or they wouldn't go to university, or and now for them to have that opportunity, and you need that, right? You need it's really hard to not have some kind of post-secondary training, right, in the world today. So it's just been such an asset, and the people at that university are just amazing people.
And the people to come out of the teaching program as well. Which leads me to my next question, Gerry, is what kind of advice would you, as a teacher that's been in School District 57 for 30 plus years, what kind of advice would you give to somebody that's just coming out of the teaching program at UNBC and looking to take on their first class or their first semester or their first class or course as a teacher ever?
I suppose it would go back to my mission statement, that, recognize, try and create a happy memories for these people, and inspire them to achieve their greatness, but recognize that each of those people in your classroom is a sacred human being, right? And just recognize the beauty of their humanity, that it's a privilege to be able to work with these people. And that's how I see my students all the time. And I'm privileged to be able to work with them, right? And they all challenge me to become a better person, right? And
what a great challenge to take on.
it is, but that's what teaching is, and there's tremendous joy in that, right? And I think I have a student who's from a difficult background or has we're having a hard time, getting through to this person or whatever, and just I don't know, just learning from that person and trying to be open and being kind. Is trying to be kind. I hope I'm kind.
Well, if there's one compliment I want to throw at you, it's your unique approach to teaching, and this, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's through your articles, through Troy Media or the PG Citizen, whether it's through your Shaw Spotlight Lessons in Learning, is that you have this large, diverse network of content and references that you use. You'll talk about, you'll incorporate names like Shaquille O'Neal or Jim Carrey or Muhammad Ali into your write-ins, and then other times you'll talk about Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hour rule, and then other times you'll talk about the backfire effect. There's just so much variety in your teaching, which I feel that the students are going to gain from, because it's captivating and interesting, and it really just keeps you engaged, whether you're reading one of your articles, whether you're watching one of your YouTube clips, or whether you're in a classroom in a seat taking in that knowledge coming from you. So that's something I really wanted to compliment you on.
Thank you. Well, the reason for that is that in order to be a teacher, you have to be a learner. You have to be constantly learning. At least that's what I believe. So maybe that would be the advice, to keep learning.
And what a great way to learn different subject matter when you know that you're going to be the one responsible for conveying that information to students, to a classroom or to any kind of respective audience, right? It's the best way to learn.
It is, absolutely.
So we have time for one more question, Gerry, and it's actually a question that we ask every single guest that we've ever had in Andrew's studio with the Crazy Damn Canadians podcast, and that is, can you think of one Canadian? They could be alive, they can be dead, they can be somebody that you've met, they can be somebody that you've never met, but can you think of one Canadian that you find incredibly inspiring, that just is at the top of the list in terms of Canadians?
Wow, we have a lot of really great people in this country. But I really, it's amazing how often I go back to this person, is Joe Clark. He was prime minister, I think, for 9 months or something like that.
It was a short term.
It was a really short term. But he was a man, or is a man, of tremendous integrity, right? Again, I was talking about that Middle Eastern, Central American issue.
El Salvador.
In El Salvador, and he was really the driving force to get Canada to for apartheid, right? We were one of the first countries to boycott, the South African government during apartheid. He was an extraordinary person, and a conservative also, a very progressive conservative. But I wouldn't mind sitting down talking to Joe Clark and say, what makes you tick, right? Do you realize the impact that you've had? And I'm sure he does. But maybe I should look and see if he's written his memoirs, right? And see if I can read that, because it'd be kind of cool, So I think it would be Joe Clark.
Yeah. Especially somebody that had a profound influence in your own life, right? Like something that you're never going to forget, and that you've carried with you for a very long time.
Yeah.
I love asking that question and just witnessing the variety of different answers that we get as well.
Right. Yeah. So thank you very much. This is really enjoyable.
Yeah, it's our pleasure, Gerry, to have you on the podcast. And before we go, how do people read your articles? How do people get in touch with you? How do people see the content that you're putting out there? Because you also have a website. Right.
It's just GerryChidiac.com, Gerry with a G.
Then maybe just spell your last name.
Chidiac.
Awesome. So all your articles are on there?
They are, or links to them are there.
Perfect. Right? And you're on social media as well?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and I post my articles there as well.
Great. So you'll link your articles to your social channels and.
Yeah, and I have YouTube as well. So yeah, that's good. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and for anyone listening and watching, actually head to your YouTube channel because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of great videos, and it's excellent content, and you're going to learn a ton. So,
well, thank you,
Gerry. Thank you so much for being a guest. Episode 23. Andrew, hit the Studio 720.